Some encounters change us so deeply that we spend the rest of our lives questioning whether they really happened. Marco Benedetti was polishing glasses behind the bar of Il Bianconero when the greatest footballer who ever lived walked through his door, 3 days after the world buried him. The November rain hammered Turin's cobblestones like bullets, and every television in Italy had been replaying footage of Diego Maradona's funeral for 72 hours straight. Yet there he stood, dripping wet in Marco's empty Juventus shrine, those unmistakable eyes scanning the black and white scarves hanging like prayer flags from the ceiling. "You're not supposed to be here," Marco whispered, his hands trembling as he set down the glass that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Maradona smiled that crooked smile that had haunted defenders across continents and said, "Neither are you, my friend, neither are you." What followed was a conversation that would shatter everything Marco believed about life, death, and the mysterious space between dreams and reality. The question isn't whether dead legends can return to settle unfinished business. The question is what happens when they offer you a chance to rewrite your own story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marco's legs gave out first. The polishing rag slipped from his fingers as he gripped the bar's edge, knuckles white against the worn mahogany his grandfather had imported from Sicily 40 years ago. The familiar weight of the brass crucifix around his neck felt heavier, pressing against his chest with each labored breath. "You're dead," he managed, the words scraping his throat raw. "I watched them lower your coffin into the ground. The whole world watched." Maradona stepped deeper into the bar, water pooling beneath his feet on the checkered tiles Marco had mopped an hour earlier. His clothes, a simple black tracksuit that clung to his stocky frame, seemed wrong somehow, too clean for a man who'd just emerged from a grave. But those eyes, Cristo Santo, those were unmistakably Diego's eyes, dark as espresso, carrying that spark of mischief that had terrorized goalkeepers from Naples to Barcelona. "Death," Diego said, running a finger along the bar's surface, "is not as permanent as people believe. Sometimes it's just an intermission." The bar felt smaller with him in it, as if his presence warped the very air. Marco's shrine to Juventus, 30 years of collected memories spanning every wall, suddenly seemed to mock him. Black and white scarves hung like mourning banners. Framed photographs of Del Piero, Platini, and Baggio stared down with glassy eyes. The 1985 European Cup, the one Marco had helped tend the pitch for, gleamed behind protective glass like a relic in a church. "This is the alcohol," Marco whispered, more to himself than to his impossible visitor. "I've finally done it. I've drunk myself into madness." He fumbled beneath the bar for the bottle of grappa he kept hidden behind the register. His fingers found only empty space. Right. He'd finished it yesterday, watching Maradona's funeral procession win through Buenos Aires while rain pelted his own windows. The irony wasn't lost on him, drowning his sorrows over a dead footballer while his own life circled the drain. "You didn't drink yourself into anything," Diego said, settling onto one of the worn leather stools with surprising grace for a dead man. "Though that liver of yours could use some attention. When did you last eat something that wasn't floating in wine sauce?" The question hit like a slap. Marco couldn't remember his last proper meal. These days, sustenance came in liquid form, and sleep arrived only when consciousness became too heavy a burden to bear. The bar was hemorrhaging money, had been for 2 years now, ever since the new shopping complex opened on Via Roma, drawing away his regulars with its gleaming sports bars and widescreen televisions. "How do you—" Marco started, then stopped. Nothing about this made sense. Dead men didn't ask about eating habits or comment on liver function. Dead men stayed buried. Diego leaned forward, elbows on the bar, studying Marco's face with the intensity he'd once reserved for analyzing defensive formations. "You know who I am." "Of course I know who you are. You're Diego Armando Maradona, the hand of God. The player who broke Italian hearts in the '86 World Cup." Marco's voice gained strength, muscle memory taking over. "You're also supposed to be decomposing in a cemetery in Buenos Aires, not sitting in my bar asking about my dietary choices." A slow smile spread across Diego's weathered features. "Ah, but which cemetery?" And more importantly, who says the dead can't travel? The wind outside howled through Turin's narrow streets, rattling the windows of Il Bianconero like restless spirits demanding entry. Marco glanced at the door, half expecting to see other impossible visitors queuing in the storm. A shiver ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. "What do you want?" Marco asked. "The better question," Diego replied, "is what do you want? Look around, Marco. Really look." Against his better judgment, Marco obeyed. The bar that had been his grandfather's pride, then his father's livelihood, then his own sanctuary, showed every sign of slow decay. Paint peeled from the walls like old skin. The espresso machine wheezed with mechanical emphysema. Empty bottles lined the shelves like tombstones marking the death of better days. But it was more than physical deterioration. The soul had gone out of the place. No laughter echoed from the corner tables. No passionate debates about transfer rumors or tactical formations filled the air with life. Even the Juventus memorabilia seemed to droop with resignation, as if the glory days were not just past but permanently buried. "I see a dying dream," Marco admitted. "Dreams don't die," Diego said softly. "They transform. Sometimes they need help with that transformation." He reached into his jacket. How had Marco not noticed the jacket before? And withdrew something that made Marco's blood freeze. A leather journal, bound with black cord, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. It landed on the bar between them with a sound like a coffin lid closing. "Some gifts," Diego said, rising from his stool, "come with a price. The question is whether you're ready to pay it." Marco stared at the journal long after the door chimed shut behind Maradona's impossible departure. The leather cover seemed to pulse in the dim light, like a sleeping heart waiting to be awakened. His hand hovered over it, trembling. Whether from the cold to grapple withdrawal or the impossibility of what had just occurred, he couldn't say. The phone's shrill ring shattered the silence. Marco jerked back, knocking over an empty wine glass that rolled across the bar with a hollow sound. The caller ID showed a number he'd been dreading. "Banca di Torino." "Benedetti," he answered, his voice hoarse. "Marco, it's Giuseppe from the bank. We need to discuss your situation." Giuseppe Torini had been 3 years behind Marco in school, a scrawny kid who'd worshipped the ground Marco walked on when he'd been the star of Juventus's youth academy. Now Giuseppe wore expensive suits and held Marco's financial future in his manicured hands. The reversal tasted like copper in Marco's mouth. "The payment's only 10 days late," Marco said, though he knew it was pointless. "It's the third late payment in 6 months. The board is pressuring me, Marco. I can only do so much." Giuseppe's voice carried genuine regret. "You have until the end of the month." After that, the line went dead. Marco set the phone down with deliberate care, as if sudden movements might shatter what remained of his world. 36 days. That's what stood between him and losing everything his family had built over 3 generations. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. Via Nizza stretched before him, slick with rain and largely empty, except for the occasional taxi ferrying passengers to warmer, more prosperous destinations. Across the street, the construction site that would soon house another chain restaurant remained dormant under tarps and scaffolding. Progress, they called it. Marco had other names for it. The bell chimed again, and Marco's heart lurched before he reminded himself that dead Argentine legends didn't typically make return visits within the same hour. Roberto Castellini shuffled through the door, shaking rain from his worn coat. At 72, Roberto was one of Marco's last remaining regulars, a retired mechanic who'd been drinking at Il Bianconero since before Marco was born. "Terrible night," Roberto muttered, settling onto his usual stool at the far end of the bar. "The usual, if you please." Marco poured a glass of Barolo, watching the wine catch the light like liquid garnets. Roberto's usual cost more than Marco could afford to serve at the price the old man could afford to pay, but some traditions mattered more than mathematics. "You look like hell, boy," Roberto observed, accepting the wine with arthritic fingers. "Worse than usual, I mean." "Bad day," Marco replied, unconsciously sliding the mysterious journal behind the register. "Banks, bills, the usual cheerful conversations." Roberto nodded with the understanding of a man who'd watched the neighborhood change around him for 7 decades. "Your father, God rest him, he faced tough times too." 1978, when the factory strikes lasted 4 months and half his customers couldn't afford a glass of water, let alone wine. Know what he did? Marco had heard the story countless times, but Roberto needed to tell it as much as Marco needed to hear it. It was part of their unspoken ritual, this sharing of family mythology in the face of present despair. He kept the bar open anyway, served coffee and bread to anyone who needed it, whether they could pay or not. The neighborhood needs a heart, he used to say, even if the heart has to beat on credit. Different times, Marco said, wiping down glasses that were already clean. Different neighborhood. Same heart, though. Roberto's rheumy eyes studied Marco with surprising intensity. Question is whether you still remember where you put yours. After Roberto left, Marco found himself alone with the weight of familiar routines. He began the closing ritual that had become as automatic as breathing, washing glasses, wiping tables, counting a till that held more IOUs than currency. Each motion carried the accumulated weight of countless identical evenings, each one bringing him closer to the inevitable end. The journal seemed to watch him from behind the register, its presence both magnetic and menacing. Marco tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the mundane tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering into impossible territories. But as he moved through the bar, straightening chairs and switching off lights, fragments of Maradona's words echoed in his memory. Dreams don't die. They transform. By the time Marco locked the front door and pulled down the metal security grate, the storm had intensified. Rain hammered the pavement with the persistence of Judgment Day, and the wind carried the scent of winter's approach. He climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment above the bar, each step an acknowledgement of another day survived rather than lived. In the small kitchen that overlooked the alley behind Il Bianconero, Marco opened the refrigerator and stared at its meager contents: half a loaf of stale bread, some questionable cheese, 3 bottles of beer, and a container of leftover minestrone that Signora Moretti had brought him last week out of pity disguised as neighborly concern. Tomorrow would bring the same struggle, the same slow hemorrhaging of hope and money. But tonight, somewhere below his feet, a leather journal waited with secrets that might change everything. Marco stood in his kitchen for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical lament, while the storm outside seemed to grow angrier, as if the very sky resented his indecision. Finally, he grabbed one of the beers and made his way back downstairs, each step echoing in the darkness of his closed bar. The journal lay exactly where he'd hidden it, tucked behind the register like contraband. In the amber glow of the single lamp he'd left burning, the leather seemed to breathe. Marco set his beer down with trembling fingers and pulled the journal forward. It was heavier than it looked, dense with the weight of filled pages. The black cord that bound it felt smooth, almost warm to the touch. No title marked the cover, no author's name, just worn leather that spoke of age and constant handling. Marco's thumb traced the edge where the cord wrapped around, and for a moment he hesitated. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. He untied the cord. The first page bore a single line written in elegant script that seemed oddly familiar. For those who understand that death is not the end of possibility, Marco turned the page and his blood turned to ice water. Giuseppe Torini, March 15, 1987. Car accident, via Roma. Second chance, warning dream, previous night. The beer bottle slipped from Marco's nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor in an explosion of glass and foam. Giuseppe from the bank, the same Giuseppe who'd called hours ago about the loan. The date was 8 months past, but Marco remembered it now. Giuseppe had missed their scheduled meeting that day, calling to reschedule because of what he'd called the strangest nightmare that convinced him to take a different route to work. Later, the news reported a multi-car collision on Via Roma at exactly the time Giuseppe would have been driving through. Marco's hands shook as he turned to the next entry. Signora Elena Moretti, September 3, 1987. Kitchen fire, gas leak, second chance, sudden impulse to visit sister instead of cooking dinner. Signora Moretti, who brought him leftover soup, who had indeed visited her sister that night instead of staying home. The fire department had responded to a gas explosion at her address, finding only an empty apartment and a kitchen destroyed by flames that should have killed anyone inside. Page after page revealed names Marco recognized. The baker who'd suddenly decided to open late the morning a delivery truck lost control and crashed into his storefront. The young mother who'd felt compelled to take her children to the park instead of staying home when a construction crane collapsed onto her building. The taxi driver who'd pulled over with sudden chest pains just moments before another car ran the red light he would have been crossing. Each entry followed the same pattern: a name, a date, a death that should have occurred, and the mysterious intervention that prevented it. Dreams, impulses, sudden changes of heart, all saving lives that had apparently been marked for ending. Marco's own name appeared on page 37. Marco Benedetti, October 12, 1985. Pitch accident, Stadio delle Alpi. Second chance, equipment failure, delayed maintenance. The entry struck him like a physical blow. October 12, 1985. The day that had ended his career, his dreams, everything he'd worked toward since childhood. But according to the journal, that hadn't been an accident. It had been, what, a scheduled death? The faulty equipment that had caused his fall, the timing that had placed him in exactly the wrong spot when the scaffolding collapsed, all of it had been meant to kill him, not merely cripple his leg and destroy his future with Juventus. The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a blade. Marco stared at it, paralyzed by the impossibility of what he'd read. On the fourth ring, his answering machine clicked on. "Marco, this is Dr. Castelletti at Ospedale Maggiore. I'm calling about your friend Roberto. He's been in an accident, a fall down some stairs. He's stable, but he's been asking for you. If you get this message..." The machine cut off, leaving Marco alone with the journal, and a choice that seemed to crystallize with terrible clarity. Roberto's name wasn't in the journal. Roberto, who just left his bar 2 hours ago. Roberto, who talked about hearts beating on credit and neighborhoods needing something worth saving. Marco looked at his watch, 11:47 p.m. Then he looked at the journal again, turning past his own entry to pages he hadn't yet read. More names, more dates, some in the past, others were dated in the future. Tomorrow, next week, next month. Names of people who hadn't died yet but apparently would, unless someone intervened. Unless someone who understood that death wasn't the end of possibility decided to act. The storm outside began to quiet, but Marco's world had become infinitely more turbulent. He stood at the crossroads between madness and miracle, holding a book that suggested both were the same thing. In 36 days he would lose his bar, but tonight he'd gained something far more impossible: the knowledge that some deaths could be prevented, some fates could be changed. The question was whether he had the courage to believe it. Marco sat frozen at his bar for what felt like hours, the journal open before him like an accusation. The broken beer bottle at his feet had stopped dripping, leaving only dark stains on the worn wooden floor, another mess in a life that had become nothing but messes. Each time he tried to close the journal, his eyes found another name, another impossible story of death cheated and fate redirected. "This isn't real," he told himself for the 100th time. "Dead men don't walk into bars, journals don't predict the future, and I don't save lives, I destroy them." But Roberto's name wasn't in the journal. That fact gnawed at him like a splinter working its way deeper into flesh. If the journal cataloged those who'd received second chances, what did Roberto's absence mean? That he was beyond saving? That his fall down the hospital stairs was exactly what it appeared? A random accident befalling an old man with arthritis and failing eyesight? Or was it something else entirely? Marco's hands shook as he turned to the pages marked with future dates. His breath caught in his throat when he saw the first entry: Sofia Castellini, November 29, 1987. Apartment fire, electrical fault. Current status: intervention pending. Sofia Castellini, Roberto's granddaughter, the medical student who visited him every Sunday after Mass. Marco had watched her grow from a gap-toothed child into a brilliant young woman with her grandfather's kind eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin. She was scheduled to die in 18 days, and according to the journal, her fate hung in the balance of some undefined intervention. The weight of responsibility crashed down on Marco like the scaffolding that had crushed his leg 2 years ago. If he believed the journal, if he accepted that Maradona's impossible visit had been real, then Sofia's life rested in his hands. But what if he was simply losing his mind? What if years of alcohol and guilt had finally snapped the last threads holding his sanity together? He thought of his father, who'd spent his final years talking to customers who weren't there, serving drinks to empty stools, convinced that the bar was still the thriving heart of the neighborhood it had been decades earlier. The doctors had called it dementia, but Marco had recognized it for what it truly was: the refusal to accept that everything meaningful had died while the body continued its stubborn persistence. Was this his own version of that slow surrender to madness? A elaborate delusion where dead footballers appeared as messengers and mysterious journals granted the power to cheat death itself? Marco stood abruptly, knocking over his stool. He needed air, needed space to think, needed anything but the suffocating weight of impossible choices. But as he reached for his coat, the journal's pages fluttered in the draft from the heating vent, revealing another name that stopped him cold. Angelo Benedetti, December 8, 1984. Heart attack, Il Bianconero. Second chance, early closing due to power outage. His father's name. His father, who had died 3 years ago of a massive coronary while cleaning glasses after closing time. Except, according to the journal, he should have died a month earlier. Would have, if a power outage hadn't forced him to close early the night his heart was supposedly scheduled to stop. Marco sank back onto his stool, the fight draining out of him. The entry was impossible to dismiss because he remembered that night perfectly. His father had been furious about the power failure, cursing the electrical company while Marco helped him secure the bar by flashlight. They'd gone upstairs for an early dinner, and his father had spent the evening telling stories about the bar's glory days, his voice stronger than it had been in months. If the journal was to be believed, that power outage had given Angelo Benedetti an extra month of life. 31 additional days to share stories, to watch his son struggle with his injured leg and damaged dreams, to offer the quiet comfort that only fathers could provide. The phone rang again, jarring Marco from his memories. This time he grabbed it on the second ring, desperate for any voice that might anchor him to the normal world. "Marco, it's Giuseppe. I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep." The banker's voice carried an edge of panic. "I keep having this dream. The same one from March when I avoided that accident on Via Roma. Something terrible is going to happen. I can feel it." Marco gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. "What kind of dream?" "Fire. I see fire everywhere, and people screaming. There's a young woman, dark hair, maybe 25, and she's trapped. I can't reach her, can't help her." Giuseppe's breathing grew ragged. "It's Sofia Castellini, isn't it? Roberto's granddaughter. I've seen her at the bank, with her grandfather." "Marco, what if this dream means something? What if I'm supposed to warn her?" The journal lay open between them across the miles of telephone wire, its secrets bleeding into reality whether Marco accepted them or not. Giuseppe's dreams had saved his own life once before. Now they were pointing toward another death, another chance to intervene, if Marco could find the courage to act on knowledge that might only exist in his crumbling mind. "Giuseppe," Marco whispered, staring at Sofia's name on the page. "What if we're both going insane? Then at least we're not going alone." The silence stretched between them across the phone line, heavy with the weight of shared impossibility. Marco stared at Sofia's name in the journal, watching the ink seem to pulse in the lamplight like a heartbeat counting down to November 29th. 18 days. In 18 days, a brilliant young woman would burn to death in her apartment, unless 2 men who might be losing their minds found the courage to act on dreams and visions that couldn't possibly be real. "We have to warn her," Giuseppe said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't care if it makes us sound crazy. I don't care if she thinks we're stalkers or lunatics. I can't live with another person's death on my conscience, Marco. I can't watch the news in 18 days and see her face knowing I could have prevented it." Marco closed his eyes, feeling the last threads of his old life, his safe, miserable, predictable life, begin to snap one by one. How do we explain it? How do we walk up to a medical student and tell her that her apartment is going to catch fire because a dead footballer told us so in a magic journal? "The same way you're going to explain visiting every other name in that book," Giuseppe replied with startling certainty. "Because you are going to visit them, aren't you? You're going to try to save them all." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Marco realized with crystalline clarity that Giuseppe was right. Somewhere in the last few minutes, without consciously deciding, he had crossed an invisible line. The man who had spent 2 years drowning in alcohol and self-pity, who couldn't save his bar or his leg or his father's failing heart, was going to attempt something far more impossible. He was going to try to cheat death itself. Yes, he heard himself say, the word emerging from depths he'd forgotten existed. God help me, yes. After Giuseppe hung up, Marco sat alone with the journal and the magnitude of what he'd just committed to. The future entries filled dozens of pages, names, dates, causes of death that hadn't happened yet but would unless someone intervened. Car accidents, heart attacks, falls, fires, a dozen different ways the universe had scheduled people to die. Some he recognized, the pharmacist from Via Garibaldi, the young priest at Santa Teresa, the widow who sold flowers near the market. Others were strangers, their names meaning nothing to him but their fates somehow his responsibility now. He thought of Maradona's words. Sometimes the game isn't about scoring goals. Sometimes it's about being in the right position to make the pass that saves the match. Marco had spent his adult life believing he was finished, that his playing days were over, that his only role was to watch from the sidelines as everything important slipped away. But maybe he'd been wrong about what game he was supposed to be playing. Marco stood and walked to the window overlooking Viennizza. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening under the streetlights. Across the way, the construction site looked different somehow. Not like an invasion anymore, but like proof that things could be rebuilt, that foundations could be laid even in the ruins of what came before. He returned to the bar and reached for the telephone, his fingers surprisingly steady as he dialed directory assistance. Turin. I need the number for Sofia Castellini on Via Mazzini. One moment, please. While he waited, Marco opened the journal to a fresh page near the back and picked up a pen. His handwriting looked foreign after so many months of doing nothing more challenging than writing IOUs, but the words came clearly. Marco Benedetti, November 11th, 1987. Spiritual death, Il Bianconero. Second chance, Maradona, I have that number for you, sir. Marco wrote down Sofia's phone number, then Giuseppe's, then turned back to the list of names with future death dates. He would need addresses, phone numbers, patterns of movement. He would need to learn these people's lives well enough to slip warning into conversation without sounding insane. He would need to become someone he'd never been before, a man who saved instead of destroyed. The clock above the bar chimed midnight, and Marco realized he was no longer in the same day or the same life. He'd woken up to 18 hours ago. The scared, broken man who'd served Roberto Castellini his last glass of wine was gone, replaced by someone whose hands didn't shake as he planned impossible interventions. Tomorrow he would visit Roberto in the hospital and ask about his granddaughter's daily routines. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate work of threading warnings through casual conversation, of finding ways to plant the seeds of life-saving impulses in the minds of the condemned. Tomorrow he would start learning how to be a guardian angel who smelled like cheap wine and walked with a limp. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Marco Benedetti felt like a player again. The hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant and desperation, a combination that reminded Marco uncomfortably of his own rehabilitation after the accident. He'd spent 3 months in these same halls, learning to walk again while watching his dreams of football glory dissolve like sugar in rain. Now he walked them with purpose, the journal tucked inside his jacket like a loaded weapon. Roberto lay propped against pillows in room 314, his weathered face mapped with new bruises, but his eyes sharp as ever. A white bandage wrapped around his forehead gave him the appearance of a wounded general surveying a battlefield he refused to surrender. Marco, you came. Roberto's voice carried genuine surprise. I wasn't sure you'd get the message. How could I not? Marco pulled a chair close to the bed, noting how Roberto's hands trembled slightly. Age or medication, he couldn't tell which. What happened? Stupidity happened. These old legs forgot they weren't 20 anymore. Roberto gestured dismissively at his injuries. I was bringing flowers to Maria's grave. It's our anniversary, you know. 53 years we would have been married today. The stairs were slick from the rain, and down I went like a sack of flour. Marco felt something twist in his chest. Roberto's absence from the journal suddenly made terrible sense. The old man wasn't scheduled for intervention because he wasn't supposed to survive whatever was coming. His time was running out naturally, and no amount of dreams or warnings would change that fundamental truth. "The doctors say you'll be fine," Marco offered, though he wasn't sure either of them believed it. "Doctors say many things. The question is whether we listen." Roberto studied Marco's face with uncomfortable intensity. "You look different today. Less lost." Before Marco could respond, a young woman appeared in the doorway, carrying a small bouquet of daisies and wearing scrubs beneath her winter coat. Sofia Castellini moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to hospital routines, but Marco caught the flash of worry in her dark eyes as she assessed her grandfather's condition. "Nonno, I came as soon as I finished my shift." She kissed Roberto's forehead, then noticed Marco. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had company. Sofia, this is Marco Benedetti. He owns Il Bianconero, that little bar I'm always telling you about." She extended her hand with a warm smile. "The famous Marco. Nonno talks about you constantly. He says you make the best espresso in Turin." Marco shook her hand, acutely aware that he was touching someone scheduled to die in 17 days. Her fingers were steady and sure. "Surgeon's hands," Roberto had once said proudly. "Hands that would save countless lives if they survived long enough to finish medical school." "Your grandfather exaggerates," Marco replied, then found himself studying her face, searching for some sign of the fire that would claim her. But all he saw was intelligence, compassion, and the particular exhaustion that came from spending 12 hours caring for strangers. "You work at the hospital?" "Pediatric rotation this month. Long hours, but I love it." Her expression grew concerned as she turned back to Roberto. "Nonno, have you been taking your medication? Your blood pressure?" "Is fine, cara mia. Stop worrying about an old man and worry about yourself for once." Roberto's voice carried the affectionate exasperation of someone who'd had this conversation many times. "When was the last time you checked that electrical box in your apartment? You know that building is older than Methuselah." Marco's blood turned to ice. The journal had listed electrical fault as the cause of the fire. He watched Sofia wave off her grandfather's concern with the casual dismissal of someone young enough to believe themselves invincible. "The building's fine, Nonno. Mrs. Torino checks everything twice a month." Sofia arranged the daisies in a water glass, then glanced at her watch. "I can only stay a few minutes. I'm covering someone's shift tonight, and I need to grab some sleep first." "You work too hard," Roberto muttered. But his pride was evident. "This one," he told Marco, "is going to be the best doctor in all of Italy. Already the other students come to her for help." "I'm sure she will be," Marco said, the words feeling like prophecy in his mouth. He had to find a way to keep her alive long enough to fulfill that promise. "Sofia, if you don't mind me asking, your apartment, is it the old building on Via Mazzini?" She nodded, surprised by the question. "Do you know it?" "I know the neighborhood. Those buildings," Marco chose his words carefully, "they can be tricky, the wiring especially. Sometimes the old systems fail without warning." Sofia laughed, a sound like music in the sterile hospital room. "You sound like Nonno. I promise you, I'm perfectly safe. The landlord just had an electrician out last month." But as she said it, Marco caught something, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, as if some buried part of her mind was trying to surface with a warning. He thought of Giuseppe's dreams, of the power outage that had saved his father's life, of all the inexplicable impulses that had cheated death throughout the journal's pages. The seed of doubt was planted. Now he had to find a way to make it grow. After Sofia left, Marco sat with Roberto in the gathering dusk, the old man's breathing steady but labored. Through the hospital window, Turin spread out below them like a circuit board, lights beginning to flicker on as the city prepared for another night. Somewhere in that maze of streets and apartments, 16 people were living their last days without knowing it. "She reminds me of her grandmother," Roberto said suddenly, his voice thick with memory. Maria had that same stubborn streak, thought she could fix the whole world with enough determination and a kind word. Marco gripped the journal inside his jacket, feeling its weight like a stone in his chest. "Roberto, what if someone told you Sofia was in danger, real danger? Would you believe them, even if it sounded impossible?" The old man turned to study Marco's face, and something shifted in his expression. a recognition that went deeper than their casual friendship. You know, Marco, in my 82 years, I've learned that impossible things happen every day. The question isn't whether to believe them. The question is what you do once you realize you're living in the middle of a miracle or a nightmare. Sometimes they're the same thing. Roberto's weathered hand found Marco's arm, the grip surprisingly strong. Whatever's weighing on you, whatever brought you here today, trust your instincts. An old man learns to read faces, and yours tells me you're carrying something heavy. Marco wanted to confess everything. The journal, Maradona's impossible visit, the crushing responsibility of lives hanging in the balance. Instead, he found himself asking, how do you convince someone to be afraid when they have no reason to be? Roberto was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. You don't. Fear comes from within, from that small voice that keeps us alive when logic fails us. All you can do is amplify that voice, make it harder to ignore. As if summoned by their conversation, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Not Sophia, but an older woman with tired eyes who'd clearly seen too many patients in too few hours. Visiting hours are ending soon, she announced, then noticed Roberto's alert expression. How are you feeling, Mr. Castellini? Like an old fool who forgot how to walk downstairs, Roberto replied with a weak smile. But my friend here has been excellent company. The nurse nodded and moved on, but her presence shattered the intimate cocoon that had formed around their conversation. Marco stood, suddenly aware that he had 16 other people to research, to understand, to somehow save. The magnitude of the task ahead felt like standing at the base of the Alps and being told to move them stone by stone. I should let you rest, Marco said, though leaving felt like abandonment. Marco. Roberto's voice stopped him at the door. Whatever burden you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. Sometimes the most important thing is knowing when to ask for help. Walking through the hospital corridors, Marco felt the weight of those words settling into his bones. Roberto was right about needing help, but how could he explain the truth to anyone who hadn't lived through it? Even Giuseppe, who'd experienced the dreams firsthand, struggled to believe in the journal's power. The lobby was nearly empty at this hour, fluorescent lights humming over scattered chairs where a few family members maintained lonely vigils. Marco paused at a payphone near the entrance, fishing coins from his pocket with hands that had begun to shake again. Not from alcohol withdrawal this time, but from the sheer magnitude of what lay ahead. He dialed Sophia's number, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before her voice answered, slightly breathless. Pronto? Sophia, this is Marco. We met at your grandfather's room today. Oh, yes. Is everything all right with Nonno? He's fine. I was wondering, this might sound strange, but would you mind checking your apartment's electrical panel when you get home tonight? Not because anything's wrong, he added quickly, but because your grandfather mentioned it, and old men worry about these things. A pause. In the background he could hear traffic, the sound of someone walking quickly through the city streets. You're both acting very strange about this. Did something happen in the building? A fire or something? Marco's heart nearly stopped. Why would you ask about a fire? I don't know, just... Lately, I've been having this weird feeling about the apartment, like something's not right. Probably just stress from exams. She laughed nervously. But yes, I'll check the electrical panel if it makes Nonno feel better. And you too, apparently. Thank you. And Sophia, if anything feels wrong, anything at all, trust that feeling. Sometimes our instincts know things our minds haven't figured out yet. After hanging up, Marco stood in the hospital lobby feeling like a man balanced on the edge of a cliff. He'd taken the first real step toward intervention, planted the first seed of life-saving paranoia in Sophia's mind. But would it be enough? And how many more impossible conversations lay ahead? Outside, the night air carried the promise of winter, sharp and clean after yesterday's rain. Marco pulled his coat tighter and began the long walk home. 16 names burning in his memory, like prayers he didn't know how to pray. The walk home took Marco past the construction site where his bar would soon be demolished, the skeletal frames of future buildings casting jagged shadows across the wet pavement. But tonight, instead of feeling like a funeral procession, the route felt like preparation for battle. Each step carried him further from the man who had answered his door to Maradona 3 nights ago, and closer to something he didn't yet understand but could feel awakening in his chest like a second heartbeat. At Il Bianconero, Marco spread the journal open across the bar and began what he knew would be the longest night of his life. 16 names stared back at him, each one a universe of responsibility. Sofia Castellini was just the beginning. Tomorrow he would need to find ways to reach them all. The pharmacist scheduled to have a heart attack while working alone, the young priest destined for a fall from the church tower, the flower seller whose brakes would fail on Via Roma. He started with the phone book, writing down addresses and cross-referencing them with the death dates in the journal. Patterns began to emerge. Many of the tragedies were clustered around specific dates, as if death itself had marked certain days on its calendar. November 28th would claim 3 lives. December 3rd, another 2. The arithmetic of mortality laid out like a schedule that Marco was somehow expected to disruption. The absurdity of his situation hit him with fresh force as he sat in his failing bar, surrounded by dusty Juventus memorabilia, planning to interfere with fate itself. 6 months ago, his biggest concern had been whether to water down the wine to make it last longer. Now he was attempting to rewrite the fundamental order of life and death, based on the word of a footballer who had died before visiting him. The phone rang, shattering the silence like an alarm. Marco's hand trembled as he reached for it, expecting Sofia's voice reporting a fire, or perhaps Giuseppe calling with news that his father had taken another turn for the worse. Instead, he heard breathing, slow, deliberate, and somehow familiar. Marco. The voice sent ice through his veins. It was Maradona, unmistakable even through the static-filled connection. But that was impossible. Maradona had left 3 nights ago and hadn't returned. "You're beginning to understand," the voice continued. "The weight of what you've accepted." "Where are you?" Marco whispered, gripping the phone with both hands. "I'm where I've always been since that night. The question is where you are, Marco. Are you still the man who let his father die alone, or have you become something else?" The words hit like physical blows. Marco's father had died of a heart attack 2 winters ago, while Marco was passed out drunk in this very bar, too deep in a bottle to answer his phone when the old man called for help. It was a wound that had never healed, a guilt that lived in his bones like winter cold. "I tried to save him," Marco said, his voice breaking. "Did you? Or did you try to save yourself from having to watch him suffer?" The line crackled with distance or something deeper than geography. "The journal isn't about redemption, Marco, it's about choice. Every name in those pages represents a moment when someone must decide whether to act or to turn away, whether to be a player or a spectator. What if I fail them? What if I can't save them all? Then you'll have failed trying, instead of succeeding at doing nothing." The voice began to fade, as if the connection was stretching across impossible distances. "Remember, sometimes the most important save happens in injury time, when everyone has given up hope. Your match isn't over, Marco. It's barely begun." The line went dead, leaving Marco alone with the dial tone and the sudden certainty that he had just crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Whether Maradona was ghost or hallucination or something else entirely no longer mattered. What mattered was that 16 people were going to die unless Marco found the courage to become someone he had never been before. He looked around Il Bianconero, at the faded photographs of championship teams, the worn bar where 3 generations of Juventus fans had celebrated and mourned, the windows that would soon look out on nothing but rubble. This place had been his sanctuary and his prison, the altar where he'd worshipped his own failure for 2 years. But perhaps it was also meant to be something else, the headquarters of an impossible campaign, the place where a broken-down groundskeeper would learn to play the most important game of his life. Marco closed the journal and walked to the espresso machine. Tomorrow would bring conversations that defied explanation, interventions that required a kind of faith he wasn't sure he possessed. But tonight, for the first time since his accident, he would go to sleep believing he had a purpose larger than his own destruction. Outside, Turin settled into the small hours of the morning, unaware that among its sleeping citizens, 16 clocks were ticking toward appointments they would never have to keep, if one man could find the courage to rewrite the script of fate itself. Marco woke to the sound of sirens cutting through the November dawn, their wailing cry pulling him from dreams of burning buildings and voices calling for help he couldn't give. He stumbled to the window of his small apartment above Il Bianconero, his heart hammering against his ribs as he pressed his face to the cold glass. Smoke rose in a black column from the direction of Via Mazzini. His hands shook as he threw on yesterday's clothes, the journal falling from his nightstand to scatter its pages across the floor. Sofia's name seemed to leap from the paper as he gathered the loose sheets, an accusation written in Maradona's impossible handwriting. Too late. He was already too late. The streets blurred past as he ran, his lungs burning with each ragged breath. 2 years of alcohol and self-pity had left him soft, unprepared for the sprint that might mean the difference between salvation and catastrophe. Behind him, Il Bianconero's door hung open like a mouth frozen in surprise, but Marco didn't look back. He couldn't afford to look back anymore. The fire trucks were already positioned around Sofia's building when he arrived, their red lights painting the gathered crowd in hellish strokes. Water arced through the morning air, but Marco could see immediately that it was too little, too late. Flames poured from the third-floor windows, Sofia's floor, with a hunger that spoke of electrical fires burning through old wiring like fuses. Anyone still inside? He gasped to a fireman directing the crowd back from falling debris. They're checking now. Most residents got out, but... The man's radio crackled with urgent voices, coordinates, and technical jargon that meant nothing to Marco but everything to the teams fighting for lives 3 stories above. Marco pushed through the crowd, searching faces for Sofia's dark hair and kind eyes. He found Mrs. Torino, the elderly landlady, wrapped in a blanket and weeping into her hands. When she looked up at his approach, her face was a mask of grief and guilt. The electrical work, she sobbed. I hired the cheapest man I could find. Madonna mia, what have I done? Sofia Castellini, Marco said urgently, gripping the woman's shoulders. Did she get out? Mrs. Torino's face crumpled. She worked all night at the hospital, came home just an hour ago. I saw her go up, but... She gestured helplessly at the inferno above them. The fire started on her floor. The old wiring, it all went up so fast. The world tilted sideways. Marco had warned her, had planted the seed of suspicion about the electrical panel, but it hadn't been enough. His half-hearted intervention had failed, and now Roberto's granddaughter, brilliant, compassionate Sofia, who was going to be the best doctor in all of Italy, was trapped in the very fire the journal had predicted. A cheer went up from the crowd as 2 firefighters emerged from the building's side entrance, carrying a figure between them on a stretcher. Marco's heart soared for one desperate moment before he realized the person was too old, too frail to be Sofia. Another resident saved, but not the one he'd been sent to protect. There's someone still up there, a voice shouted from the crowd. 3rd floor, corner apartment. Marco watched the fire chief's face tighten as he spoke into his radio. The flames had consumed too much of the building's structure. Sending men up to the 3rd floor now would mean risking more lives for someone who might already be lost to the smoke and heat. It was then that Marco understood the true cruelty of his situation. The journal hadn't given him the power to save lives. It had given him the burden of watching them end with perfect, terrible foreknowledge. He was meant to be a witness to tragedies he was powerless to prevent, carrying the weight of advanced knowledge like a stone in his chest. I should have tried harder, he whispered, the words lost in the roar of flames and water and diesel engines. I should have made her believe. The building's corner window exploded outward in a shower of glass and sparks. When the smoke cleared, Marco could see into Sofia's apartment. The medical textbooks scattered across her desk, the framed photo of her and Roberto, the small kitchen where she'd probably made coffee just hours ago, exhausted from her night shift and looking forward to sleep. All of it consumed by the electrical fire that Mrs. Torino's cut-rate contractor had made inevitable. Marco sank to his knees on the wet pavement, the journal's pages heavy in his jacket pocket. 16 names, and he'd failed the first one. How many others would burn, fall, crash, and drown while he stumbled through Turin with his impossible burden, always one step behind the catastrophes he was meant to prevent? The crowd around him continued to watch and hope, but Marco closed his eyes against the sight of Sofia's building becoming her funeral pyre. The game was over before it had truly begun.